Hi, everybody, and a very pleasant good evening. Welcome to Dodger Stadium. Well, actually, welcome to the media room at Dodger Stadium. This would be where the manager of the Dodgers would sit, explaining how the Dodgers won a game, or sadly, how they lost one, to the members of the media, both radio, television, and newsprint. But tonight, I'm sitting here quietly by myself in a room that has experienced a great deal of emotion. And come to think of it, I bring a little emotion here to the dinner tonight as well. First of all, I regret and I'm sorry that I couldn't join you in person, but the way things worked out, it was virtually impossible to make the trip from Los Angeles to Troy, New York. And secondly, I'm rather humbled by the award. I have always thought of myself as that street kid playing stickball with your shirt tail hanging out. And now all of a sudden, I am humbled and appreciative that I'm going into the New York State Hall of Fame. And what really pleased me, the thing that really makes me feel happy, is it's the Johnny Podres Award. Johnny Podres was one of the great characters that I've known in my 65 years with the ball club, and we'll get to John in a minute. But as far as myself is concerned, it started when I was about 8 years old. I would fall in love with the roar of the crowd. I loved to crawl underneath a big radio that we had at home, and there was a cross piece underneath, and I'd put a pillow in there and crawl underneath the radio. And the speaker would be directly over my face. And it might be a football game because in those days, first, there was no television. And secondly, the only thing that I could get on the radio would be college football on a Saturday. So I'd crawl under there, and it might be Michigan, Ohio State, Tennessee, Alabama, Oklahoma, Texas. I had no idea who was playing. But whenever someone did something that elicited the roar of the crowd, I was in heaven, because the crowd noise would come out of that speaker like water out of a shower head, and I would just get goosebumps from head to toe. That's really what inspired me to take all the steps. First, I loved the crowd. Then I wished I was there. And then finally, in the evolution of a thought, I was hoping that I would be there to broadcast someday. So that's what happened. When I was in school, I went to Fordham University, played a little baseball up there, probably had 3 games in all the games I played that I would even remember. One, I hit my only home run. I hit it against CCNY, and the game was covered by the Bronx Home News. And I saw the cameraman at home plate, and I slowed down. And when I got to home plate, I kind of jumped in the air and put my hand out like I'd seen all the big leaguers do. Well, the next day, sure enough, they had the picture. I swear to you, it was completely out of focus. It might have been the first picture the fella had ever taken in his life. And then to compound the fracture, underneath the caption of the picture was Jim Tully scoring on his home run against CCNY. The second time I got my name in the paper was probably the only really good game I ever played in college or high school for that matter. We played NYU, New York University, big rival, and we thumped them. And during that game, believe it or not, I went 3 for 4. I even drove in a couple of runs. And that game was covered by the New York Times, a writer named Lou Efrat, whom I would know for years later. And Lou wrote his story, and the next morning I couldn't wait, because I know somewhere, having gone 3 for 4, that I'm going to get my name mentioned in the paper. It was mentioned, all right. It was like the 3rd paragraph down, and the paragraph began, after Scully fanned, comma, the Rams went on, blah, blah, blah. And I thought, that's great. The only time I made out that day, that's the day I got my name in the paper. And then the other memorable game, I was not mentioned at all except in the box score, was Fordham played Yale University. The first baseman for Yale, the captain of the team, his name was George Herbert Walker Bush. That's right. I was fortunate to play against the future president of the United States. I met him later on. We actually played golf together, and I remember kidding him because he's a wonderful human being. I said, Mr. President, as long as you're in the White House, you can say anything you want about your baseball career. But remember, the day that you step out of that White House, we both went 0 for 3. Well, he just loved that. I might add that Yale won the ball game, but it was a very closely contested game. So from the campus, I then went to work at WFUV, an FM station at Fordham. From there, I went to CBS. Eventually, I met Red Barber. And although I didn't know it at the time, there was an emergency at CBS Sports. And I came home one night, and my red-haired, excitable mother said, "Oh, Vin, you'll never guess who called." And I said, "No, hon, who?" And she said, "Red Skelton." And I said, "No, I don't think it was Red Skelton. How about Red Barber?" Well, it was Red Barber. I did a couple of football games for Red. Eventually, Ernie Harwell, bless him, he moved on to the New York Giants. And Red decided to have a kid, a young man whom he could mold in the position of being a sports announcer. And the next thing I know, I returned his call. And he said to me, "Where will you be at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning?" And I said, "In your office." He said, "No, you will be in the office of Branch Rickey, the president of the Brooklyn Dodgers." Well, I was scared to death. Next day went over, got the job on a 1-month option. They took me down to Vero Beach, Florida for spring training, and at the end of the month, they would either leave me there for the alligators or take me with them back to Brooklyn. Well, they took me back to Brooklyn, and that's 65 years ago. It's rather remarkable that I've been around that long, and I'm eternally grateful to the good Lord who has helped me immeasurably throughout my life and certainly throughout my career. Things were different in Ebbets Field. First of all, the ballpark is so much smaller. I mean, out here in Los Angeles, we played in the Coliseum, where we actually had about 93,000 during a regular season World Series game, and we also had a crowd of about 113,000 when we played an exhibition game with the Boston Red Sox. Here at Dodger Stadium, we'll get a crowd of just under 55,000. But in those days in Brooklyn, in a small ballpark, we would average 20,000, 15,000, and there was a particularly lazy afternoon, a Saturday. It was probably 6,000 or 7,000 people in the ballpark. And the difference between the sizes also meant the difference in the crowd. Today, the crowd, and I don't mean to demean anybody, but the crowd today is like wallpaper. It makes a lot of sound, but you're not aware of individuals. Oh, in Ebbets Field, you were very aware of individuals. Certainly, you have to remember Hilda Chester. She was the loudest fan in all the world, and to add to her, she always carried a big cowbell, so you couldn't miss her wherever in the ballpark she was. This one lazy afternoon, I was sitting next to Red Barber, very proper. He was doing the game, and I was keeping score, and all of a sudden, I heard this voice. It had to be Hilda. No one else spoke like that. And the voice said, "Vin Scully, I love you." And the crowd laughed, and I put my head down, kind of shy about it, and she answered back, "Look at me when I'm talking to you." Well, that really destroyed the crowd, but that's how personal it was at Ebbets Field. I also was embarrassed, probably the worst on television I've ever been doing a Dodger ball game. It was the bottom of the 9th inning, Dodgers trailing by a run. They had runners at second and third, first base open, and Duke Snider was the batter. But the key to the situation was Roy Campanella on deck, because he was having a huge day. And I noticed on ball one, our first base coach named Jake Pittler. He had silver hair, and he was like a bantam rooster. And on ball one, he kind of jumped in the air. So I was kind of watching him again, and on ball two to Snider, he bent down, picked up a handful of grass, threw it in the air. Oh, the next pitch, he took his cap off and threw it. It was ball three. So I said to the assistant director, "Do me a favor, take a picture of Jake Pittler. I won't even have to say the count, because his reaction will tell us whether it's a ball or strike." Then he explained that to the crowd. And so all of a sudden, the screen was just full of Jake Pittler, this bantam rooster pacing up and down in the first base box. And I then began to repeat it over and over again. Watch his reaction. I won't have to tell you the count, whether it's a ball or strike. I was calling people out of bathrooms and off the street and out of offices. Watch his reaction. Well, the next pitch, and I knew Duke would be taking, was ball 4. And Jake did only one thing. He stood there and began to adjust his underwear in a rather private and sensitive area. Well, I then had to say ball 4, which also put me in an embarrassing spot. A couple of days later, I was coming into the dressing room and I heard this voice from the far corner, "Hey, Scully." And I looked up and it was Jake. I said, "Hi, Jake." He said, "What do you say about me on television?" I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, I got a package in the mail and I opened it up and it was a small can of Johnson & Johnson baby powder." So at least it came out that well for Jake. But it was a pretty tough moment on television, I can tell you the truth. There was also a wonderful player in those days, a pitcher, a black man by the name of Dan Bankhead. And Dan was a fellow who never said much, and when he did speak, he was certainly worth listening to. And in Ebbets Field, there was a pecking order in the dressing room. When you walked in the door, the first person you saw was Pee Wee Reese. He was the captain, the star, and the most respected player of all. And then next to him would be Gil Hodges, and then Duke Snyder. And it worked their way down the line, all the stars. Eventually, way in the back of the room, right where the Coca-Cola machine was, there was a locker, and that was where Dan Bankhead was. Now, this particular day, Dan Bankhead and the Dodgers had lost a game. And they lost a very tough one-run game that involved Jackie Robinson. Jackie was called out to end the game, and he was furious. He was livid. He was sure, absolutely positive, that he was safe. And he went to his locker. Now, in the dressing room in those days, it was a metallic locker and a metallic stool. And Jackie was throwing equipment into that metallic locker, slamming that stool against the locker and slamming. He was really letting off some steam. And all of a sudden, in an otherwise quiet locker room, you heard the voice of Dan Bankhead. And Dan was sitting by his locker with a towel across his loins, glasses right down to the tip of his nose, and he spoke. And he said, "Robinson." And Jackie stopped. And Bankhead said, "Robinson, you is not only wrong, you is loud wrong." And I never forgot that. From that moment on, I thought, dear God, I know in my career as a broadcaster, I will be wrong. I'm as human as possible, so I know I'll be wrong a lot of times. But please, don't ever let me be loud wrong. Now, I mentioned at the very beginning that I was so happy and honored to be going into the New York State Hall of Fame, but even more important than that, I love the idea that I'm receiving an award with the name of Johnny Padres on it. Because Johnny was truly a memorable character. Figure it out, 65 years. How many players have I met, talked with, lived with, wearing Dodger uniforms? And there's only a few that really stick out in my mind, and one of them is Johnny Padres. Give you an idea. I mean, remember the 1955 World Series? That's the only time the Dodgers ever won a World Series, and they did it against the New York Yankees. And typical of the Dodgers, in that 55 World Series, they began by losing the first 2 games. So now, Game 3, all the pressure is on whom? They nominate a young left-hander on his birthday, 23 years old, Johnny Padres. And he went out and beat the Yankees 8-3 and was as calm as you could expect, a really grizzled veteran. And then the series went on. And now all of a sudden, it's the 7th game. It's in Yankee Stadium. New York has come to a stop still. No one moves. Everyone is watching, listening, and waiting. Will the Dodgers finally win their first and only, or will they lose to the Yankees yet again? Well, Who goes to the mound in that clutch situation? Johnny Padres. How did he come out? He won the game 2-0. That was the game, among other things, where Gil Hodges, who had had such a bad World Series in 1953, drove in the only 2 runs to give the Dodgers that 2-0 victory. And it was also the game people will remember if they even bother to look, and that was the game of the great catch by Sandy Amoros, racing towards the left field line. He threw left-handed. That was the break. He was able to reach the ball with his right hand and then throw back to the infield, double up Gil McDougald, and eventually the Dodgers won their first and only World Championship in Brooklyn. Was that the end of Johnny Padres? Oh, no. In 1959, who was on the team and who helped the Los Angeles Dodgers to win their first World Series here in their new city, but Johnny Padres? And who was here to open up Dodger Stadium, opening day 1962, the Point, as they called him, Johnny Padres. And I remember before he was a World Series hero, I can remember 3 kids, young, talented players with the Dodgers. Johnny Padres, Don Zimmer, a shortstop, and Tommy Lasorda, who eventually went into the Hall of Fame as a major league manager. But they were 3 kids. And in those days, a first-year player was given a contract worth $5,000. Today, to put it in proper perspective, a first-year player gets $500,000. But anyway, back to the days of the $5,000, where the money was really tough to come by. Almost all the players played during the winter in Latin America, or they worked hard to make some money to survive during the off-season. I think the top salary in Brooklyn, believe it or not, was like $42,000. Anyway, things were that way for young players. So Padres, Zimmer, and Lasorda would go to Coney Island. And of course, they're major leaguers. They could throw accurately and throw hard. And they would knock over all those loaded bottles of lead, and they would win big stuffed animals of every kind. What would they do with the stuffed animals? They would bring them back to the dressing room and sell them to the married fathers, either on the Dodgers or visiting teams. They had their own little corporation of winning and then selling these little stuffed toys. That was life in the big leagues. Another member of mine of the Dodgers who will be forever in my heart as well as in my mind, and that would be Ralph Branca. Oh, sure, they always link his name to the home run by Bobby Thompson, but he is a much bigger man in heart and spirit. In fact, when I think about it, it's pretty easy for Bobby to spend his life taking a bow for that home run. It was a pretty heavy cross for Ralph to carry for the remainder of his life. And when it's all said and done, I think Ralph not only met the occasion head on, and every time Bobby Thompson was honored, they always wanted Ralph to be there. And it seemed to me that Ralph grew and grew in stature and in reputation. The fact that he was able to go through that terrible period and at the same time keep his own natural feelings without intruding upon Bobby's. It was a magnificent job. And due to Ralph and his wife Ann, probably the greatest moment certainly in my life, the fact that through Ann's father, after the 1956 World Series, the Dodgers went to Japan. They were kind enough to take me with them. And then Ralph and Ann and I continued our journey around the world. And because of her father, we had an audience with the Pope, Pope Pius XII to specify. Now, my Irish red-haired mother was deeply religious, and when I told her that I was going to have an audience with the Pope, she said, "Oh, Vinny, please, whatever you do, remember everything so that when you come back, you can tell me and I can have this vicarious feeling of having made the trip with you." And I said, "Mom, you got it." Well, that Sunday came. Ann and Ralph had had the beefeater, as they call those men, come to the hotel, hand her the silver plate with the invitation on it, and we went to visit the Pope. And it was very interesting because they would move you from one room to the next room, and each room was a museum unto itself, from gifts from kings and emperors down through the centuries. And the more times you move, the closer you get to the Pope's apartment. And we finally moved where we were next door. And it was an intimate audience with the Pope. There were only 14 people there. And we stood in this room. There were big French doors at the other side of the room. Sunlight was pouring in, and His Eminence now suddenly came into the room. Now, he was tall and lean. He had dark olive eyes, and he stood quietly for a moment in front of those windows. And the sunlight streaming through his shoulders, it really took your breath away. Meanwhile, the 14 of us stood in a U. We were also instructed not to begin a conversation with His Holiness, only to speak if he spoke to you. And as he entered the U, he went right to the middle of it, turned around, and they took a picture. It was all perfectly staged. We were all around him. And then he stepped out of the U and started his visit with each of us. And he spoke in German. He spoke in French. He spoke in Italian, of course. And as he worked his way around, he suddenly came to Anne Branca. And Anne, a very religious lady, someone I've loved for years, she held up a rosary and she said, "Your Holiness, would you bless my family?" And even though that was not what we were supposed to do, the Pope answered yes, and he blessed her. Then he turned to Ralph. Now remember, I'm trying to remember every single thing that I can tell my mom. And now he turns to Ralph. And he said to Ralph, "Where are you from, my son?" And Ralph said, "I'm from New Rochelle, New York, Your Holiness." "Oh, yes," he said, "I know where that was. I was there many years ago. And now it's going to be my turn. And I'm telling you the truth. I'm standing there. My throat is dry. My hands are wet. My legs are actually trembling." And he turned, and I'm saying, "Now remember, for Mom." And he turned and looked me right in the eye, and he said, "Are you with them?" And I nodded, and he moved on. And that was it. Now, how would you like to go home and tell your mother the Pope said, "Are you with them?" And you know what? I've carried that picture in my heart and in my mind for 65 years. Because if somebody says, "Hey, there's Vin Scully," I always think, no, it's Vin Scully of the Dodgers, and I'm with them. Thank you so very much. God bless, and have a wonderful evening.